everyone, and welcome to CEC Gurukul Lectures Live. Today we will be discussing a very important topic, that is structure and function of the United Nations. To begin with, whenever we hear the phrase that United Nations is prevalent everywhere in international arena, this is why we say that United Nations is global diplomatic and political organizations. One of the foremost aim of United Nations is maintaining international peace and stability. The United Nations was established in the year 1945. Now, this year 1945 is significant to comprehend when we will take the lecture forward in terms of understanding the history, the evolution and the context within the formation of United Nations organizations. 1945 is also the year when the Second World War comes to an end. This is why whenever we try to understand United Nations, it is very essential to place it together with the horrific aftermath and the events of the Second World War. Now, what happens here is that after the Second World War, there were fears with the Second World War ending with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A third world war would have indeed proved very fatal for the world. This is why international leaders proposed to create a new global organization to maintain peace and avoid war. And the outcome of that was United Nations. Well, whenever you're trying to study United Nations, do visit its website that I presented to you right now, www.un.org. This website in itself is a good study reference material for all of us in order to comprehend the study of structure and function of United Nations. Now, dear students, let us understand that when United Nations was formed, it had only 51 member states. The United Nations is headquartered in the New York City. Now today, dear listeners, when we have a look, today the membership of United Nations too has witnessed expansion. Today there are nearly 193 members, and there have been several UN initiatives, to name a few like preventing conflict, ensuring peace. There have been areas where United Nations has been actively engaged in providing food and medical assistance in emergency. There have been examples when United Nations has been at the forefront to tender humanitarian support. There have been numerous examples where United Nations has accomplished hundreds and several of peacekeeping missions. This is why when we look at the structure and functioning of United Nations, it is indeed an organization that has its own unique significance. Now, let's look at a few events in history. 1st January 1942 is very essential and significant when we try to look at the historical evolution of United Nations organization. The name, dear listeners, do you know, the name United Nations was coined by the then United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Then, whenever we talk about Declaration of UN, that's also very significant that during the Second World War, 26 nations came together and pledged to continue fighting against the Axis powers. This took the form of Declaration of UN. Then again, 24th October 1945 is the date and the day when United Nations officially comes into existence. Now, in 1945, representatives of 50 countries met in San Francisco. The charter was signed on 26 June 1945 by representatives of 50 countries. And Poland, it is very essential to see here, Poland has been one nation that has been as the factor, one of the axis, pivotal axis within which the Second World War prevailed. Poland was not represented at the UN conference. Poland signed it later and became one of the original 51 members states of UN. Now, this is why we say that the United Nations officially came into existence on 24th October 1945. The charter then had been ratified by China, France, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, United States, and by a majority of other signatories. Dear listeners, every year 24th October is celebrated as the UN Day. Now, moving ahead, why is it said that United Nations, UN, is a platform, an effort, a movement in the quest for safer world? Because it goes without saying, it is very much accepted and seen that the work of the United Nations reaches every corner of the globe. Let's take into account some of the significant activities United Nations has been doing. Peacekeeping, peace building, conflict prevention, humanitarian assistance, and these many areas have been expanded. Yes, dear listeners, there are many other ways wherein United Nations and its system that we call as, by system we imply specialized agencies, funds, the UN programs, they have been playing a great role. Now, there have been new areas wherein UN has played a pivotal role. To talk about here, sustainable development, environment and refugee protection, disaster relief, counter-terrorism, disarmament and non-proliferation, promoting democracy. Now, these areas, they are the new areas of engagement by the United Nations as compared to the traditional ones, that is peacekeeping, peace promotion, amongst others. So, what this brings to us is the wide ambit of role and arenas wherein which United Nations is active. This is why it is said that UN is the quest, it's a movement for the quest for a safer world. Let's understand other areas. When we look at human rights, United Nations is playing an important role in order to foster respect for human rights. When we look at gender equality, United Nations through its various initiatives is making effort to factor in gender equality. When we look at governance, United Nations is playing an important role to ensure transparency and work out mechanisms to fight corruption together. Economic and social development. International health is one area wherein UN has played an important role, which we shall also be seeing in the later part of the lecture to come. Clearing landmines, expanding food production programs. All these are areas wherein UN has made positive contribution, has made an impact on the lives of people and nations and international system as well. Now, let's come to our next question. what are the main purposes of the United Nations. Now, when we go by the website of United Nations, we get to know about the 4 main purposes. The United Nations has the following main purposes. First, to keep peace throughout the world. Second, to develop friendly relations amongst nations. Third, to help nations work together to improve the lives of poor people, to conquer hunger, disease and illiteracy, and to encourage respect for each other's rights and freedoms. Followed by a very important function, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations to achieve these goals. Now, once again, when we look at these functions, this brings to us to our next question: how has the history and evolution of United Nations made us come to this conclusion of its 4 main functions? Now, it is very essential to know that the preceding years before the formation of United Nations were the forerunners of the United Nations. Let's bring it here. Now, 1865 to 1874. For the first time, attempt was made by the states to establish International Telegraph Union. Now, this becomes essential in order to factor in cooperation amidst states' behavior. 1874, we had Universal Postal Union. Now, how do these unions become important? Because they gave the primary experience of what it means for nations to work together for managing common affairs in the realm of international organization. When we look at 1899 to 1902, now in 1899, the International Peace Conference was held in The Hague, and its main aim was to elaborate instruments for settling crises peacefully, preventing wars, and codifying rules of warfare. Somewhere, this conference too gave an example of what it means for nations to come together at a global international terrain and work out mechanisms to factor peace and avoid war. What happened after this conference was that it adopted the Convention for Pacific Settlement of International Disputes, which began its work in 1902. Now, the year 1919, dear listeners, this is very essential because the forerunner of the United Nations, that was the League of Nations, was established. Following the same year, under the Treaty of Versailles, the International Labour Organization was established in 1920. Now, the aim of the League of Nations was to promote international cooperation and achieve peace and stability. It is essential for us to understand that with all these events, these preceding years definitely had their own contribution in the formation of United Nations in the year 1945. Now, before we actually come to that, let's understand why did the League of Nations, which was called as the forerunner of the United Nations, why did the League of Nations fail? Now, as pointed out, that the League of Nations was a forerunner for the United Nations, but the League of Nations stopped its activities after its failure to prevent the Second World War. Now there's a difference here between First World War and Second World War. League of Nations was a post-First World War phenomenon. Now the First World War primarily was a European phenomena. It was limited within the European continent. But what was essential about the Second World War was that it had its ramifications beyond the Europe also. The First World War was not that colossal in terms of its loss and damage to lives and liberty. The Second World War was much more lethal and dreadful in terms of its impact on the military, on the civilians, on the population, and destruction of world resources. So when we look at the failure of League of Nations, now many countries never even joined the organization. To name here, United States, Germany and Soviet Union were not even allowed to join the League of Nations. The international relations of member countries conflicted with the League's requirement for collective security. Then the League did not have its own army, and pacifism was one thing which was somewhere followed by Britain and France, and this is why these countries were reluctant for any kind of military action if the League was taking. So all these things, all these factors somewhere paved way for ineffectiveness of the League of Nations. So this is why when countries attacked, the League could not stop. Now history is a very beautiful thing. This is why I always advise all my listeners that do try to refer to these facts of histories. Historyonthenet.com is one resource which you can use for your further revision and reference. Now coming back to our discussion, now when we look at the function of United Nations, how the historical precedent had an impact on deciding the functions of United Nations, let's come to the structure. Now the structure too has a link with the context within which the United Nations was formed. The structure of the United Nations is based around its charter. The United Nations Charter has 111 articles. Now this charter establishes 6 parts or 6 organs of the United Nations. We shall be looking at these 6 organs in details in the lecture to come. Let's name it: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, and last, the Secretariat. Now let us take these organs one by one. The General Assembly. All members of the United Nations are represented in the General Assembly. The General Assembly periodically has the power to make recommendations to promote international peace. It tries to strive for international economic and social cooperation. The General Assembly makes an effort to promote human rights. The General Assembly is expected to meet on a regular basis. Now let's have a look at the voting within the General Assembly. When a vote is taken, it needs 2/3 majority for it to be passed. We now move on to the next organ of United Nations, very significant one, the Security Council. The Security Council consists of 11 members. 5 of these are the permanent members. Who are the permanent members? Let's take it into account. United States of America, USSR, now Russia, Great Britain, China, and France. The General Assembly appoints another 6 members who are non-permanent members. Maintaining peace and security at the international level is the main focus of the Security Council. Now, each member of the Security Council is given 1 vote, and a vote of 7 members is needed for action to be taken. All 5 permanent members have to agree with the course of action. Once again, coming back to where we were trying to understand the history. Why UN and League of Nations? How are they different? What are the similarities and differences between United Nations and the League of Nations? One of the main similarities is that both were global organizations that aimed for maintaining international peace and security. They both wanted to avoid war. Now, of course, in terms of membership and structure, United Nations is very much rampant as compared to League of Nations. But one of the primary distinguishing features was that the League of Nations did not have its own army. Whereas when we are trying to study the UN Security Council, here is one of the major differences to League of Nations, that is, the United Nations has the ability to enforce its decision as each member state has to pledge to provide military component dependent on its national wealth and capability. Coming to the next organ of United Nations, Economic and Social Council. It aims to promote and improve the economic and social well-being of those living in the member states. Now, when we try to look at the Economic and Social Council, the Article 57 gives a clear indication of the areas within which the Council works. Let's understand them. Health, education, economic, social, cultural issues, and promotion of the position of the women in the world. Now, the members of the Economic and Social Council have 1 vote each. Moving ahead to the next organ of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice. ICJ is often called as the main judicial body of the United Nations. All members of the United Nations are party to the International Court. The ICJ consists of 15 members and only 2 members come from the same country at any one time. All members of the United Nations have to agree to abide by the decisions of the International Court of Justice. The last organ of the United Nations is the Secretariat. This comprises of the Secretary General, and it is the body that runs the United Nations. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly, which receives recommendations from the Security Council. The Secretary General of the United Nations is the United Nations Chief Administrative Officer also. Now, dear listeners, as we take the program forward, let's take the other issue, that is, what is the significance of United Nations? We have understood its role, we have seen in its structure, and then let's try to understand its significance. Now, it goes without saying that United Nations is the most representative intergovernmental organization of the world. When we try to look at the significance, the role in world affairs of United Nations is irreplaceable by any other organization. When we look at its role, it is essential to be seen or the amount of enormous contributions it has made in maintaining international peace and security, promoting cooperation among states, its role in fostering international development, and the international cooperation that is the utmost need of the hour for mankind in order to meet the challenges of the global and regional issues. The United Nations has the sanity, has the power, has the prowess to play a pivotal and positive role in this regard. This is why it is often argued that there is a need to strengthen the role of the United Nations in this new century and promote the establishment of a just and reasonable international and political economic order that is the need of the hour. And to foster this just and reasonable global governance, United Nations indeed has played and has to play and can play also a very significant role for being a global organization of paramountcy. Now, there is often a debate that we hear about the reform of the Security Council. Now, this comes from the fact that there is a need for enhancing the role of the developing countries as major contributors to the United Nations. When we try to understand the Security Council, there is a need to accept the fact that improvement of working methods in order to make the Council more effective and representative is the need of the hour. Now, realities change. Our past and present are related, yet they are different. Same applies to United Nations. When the number of United Nations member states has increased from 51 in 1945 to 193 today, therefore, when this membership has taken a leap, Security Council should also try to factor in this changed reality. This is why it is often said that current composition of the Security Council does not reflect changed global realities. The Council needs to reflect today's world order in order to be able to give a true picture and also tackle today's global complex challenges. Now, whenever we try to understand United Nations, it is very essential to understand the words that is, you all must have heard, dear listeners, the UN system, the UN family. Now, the UN system or the UN family, it means that the UN itself and many affiliated programs and funds and specialized agencies with all their own membership, leadership and budget, and they all have been playing a unique role of their own. Let us have a look at them one by one. Now, programs and funds are financed through voluntary rather than assessed contributions. Specialized agencies, we will be seeing it in just some time. The UN specialized agencies are independent international organizations funded by both voluntary and assessed contributions. Now, some insights into UN funds and programs. At the outset, United Nations Development Program. It works in nearly 170 countries and territories. It helps to eradicate poverty, reduce inequality, and build resilience so countries can sustain progress. It is often called as UN's Development Agency. Moving ahead, we have UN Habitat that aims to promote socially and environmentally sustainable human settlements, development and it tries to work in the areas to achieve adequate shelter for all. Moving ahead, we have UNICEF, which works in 190 countries and territories in order to save children's life, to defend their rights and help them fulfill their potential from early childhood to adolescence. We have WFP, which aims to eradicate hunger and malnutrition, and it is also called as the world's largest humanitarian agency. Now let us have a look at some of the UN specialized agencies. The Food and Agriculture Organization. This is a forum for negotiating agreements between developing and developed countries. It is a source of technical knowledge and information to aid development. Followed by that, we have International Labour Organizations. This is very active in the realm of international labour rights by formulating international standards on the freedom to associate, collective bargaining, abolition of forced labour, equality of opportunity and treatment. We have the IMF, International Monetary Fund. It aims to foster economic growth and employment by providing financial assistance to countries to help ease balance of payments adjustment and technical assistance. We have the IMO, International Maritime Organization, that aims to provide comprehensive shipping regulatory framework addressing safety and environmental concerns. We have the ITU, which is the specialized agency for information and communication technologies. So, dear listeners, how we see that the ambit of United Nations today is way much more broad. When we try to understand the structure and function of United Nations, we have to see the significant role an international organization plays in the global governance. Now, whenever we try to look at the global governance, IR has been a discipline of debates. The earliest debate, that is the idealist and the realist debate, it is still prevalent today in order to comprehensively see that can international organizations avoid war. When we go as per the idealist point of view, for them international organizations have their own kind of significance to ensure that wars can be avoided. Whereas realist debate in IR always tries to see it in terms of statism leading to survival followed by self-help. Therefore, they doubt the efficacy of international organization in fostering peace and avoid war because national interest is seen as primacy for them. Whereas for the idealists, the liberal institutionalists, the forums like United Nations have their own significance in order to foster global trade, peace, security, and of course to avoid war. The Second World War was the biggest war in the human history. Now, this Second World War gave lessons to mankind, and United Nations is a product of thinking over how to avoid another war, taking a lesson from the horrific events of the Second World War. When we try to see that how international leaders came together to propose to create a new global organization to maintain peace and avoid war, it also talks about that how norms of cooperation are still prevalent in global governance. The idea of international relations as completely as akin to an absolute gain, or in the sense of a zero-sum game, may not then give a true picture of the world when we try to see that how countries come together to think on issues together, to hunt for solutions together, and United Nations is definitely a prime example how relative gains are given primacy by the nations, how nations do not see their relations in the sense of a zero-sum competition. No doubt the membership of United Nations has expanded, as we have seen in the lecture, from just 51 member states. Today there are 193 members. The mandate of the work of United Nations too has increased from mere prevention of conflict to ensuring peace. Today, through its specialized agencies, funds and programs, the United Nations is playing an important role in providing food and medical assistance in emergencies, humanitarian support, accomplished hundreds of successful peacekeeping missions. This in itself is very essential to understand that United Nations in the contemporary century has played an important role and will continue to play so. There may be some kind of drawbacks of its work, but that does not merit the thing that we completely do away or we put a big question mark on the efficacy. It has its own strengths as well as its own weaknesses. The need of the hour is to enhance its strengths and try to work out mechanisms to try to contain the weaknesses. When we try to see that how United Nations has come a big way from the year 1942, as we see, was a very troublesome year in the history of the course of the Second World War, and during that United States President coining the term United Nations, followed by the declaration of UN where countries did pledge, and this pledge is all the more significant to revisit for us. Every year on 24th October, when the UN Day is celebrated, countries revisit this pledge to promote peace, to avoid war, and then this in itself is significant in terms of norms that go on to bind the world polity for peace and for cooperation. And when we try to see that how the mandate of United Nations from mere 51 countries to a broad membership today, from just peacekeeping efforts to human rights, women issues, United Nations has its own prime significance. When we try to see that United Nations, no wonder it is called as the quest for a safer world, because the work of United Nations reaches every corner of the globe. What we saw in the lecture, that from peacekeeping to peace building, conflict prevention, humanitarian assistance, there are new areas where United Nations and its system, specialized agencies, funds and programs have played an important role. And some of the areas wherein we saw how United Nations has been playing an important role, let's recall sustainable development, environment, refugees, counter-terrorism, disarmament, non-proliferation, promoting democracy. Now this again becomes important for us to understand, because today the notion of security has also changed. Today we do not just limit idea of security to military warfare, army, navy, etc. Today human security is defined by non-traditional security dimensions too, where the threat cuts across all borders. For example, terrorism, pandemics, climate change. Each country is equally vulnerable. Each country calls for concerted, coordinated action. And United Nations, definitely through its initiatives, through its funds and programs, is playing an important role for the same. Now, whenever we see that today global governance in itself is complex, because today problems of the world are as such that what is global is connected to the local, and what is local has reach with the global. Now, in such a scenario, when we try to look at areas like human rights, gender equality, international health, food production, the domestic and international are somewhere linked. So what the neo-realists talked about, an anarchy, for example, like a very fine distinction between domestic and the international, somewhere that distinction is getting blurred with the space-time compression of global processes of trade, finance, production, technology. Now within this, the United Nations role is definitely being redefined. There are new challenges on the UN system too, to reflect on these new emerging areas and ensure holistic solutions for world governance and for the problems that are coming forward. So when we again try to revise at how the main 4 functions of UN2 have witnessed new changes. Peace again is a holistic concept today. To develop friendly relations requires new kind of coordinated thinking because issues of the world overlap today. We have to how to help nations to work together. It is indeed a very challenging task because nations are facing coordinated threats, new forms of security dimensions, and how to, in amidst all these challenges of the global world, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations to achieve the goals. Now, whenever you try to study United Nations and the role it plays, do revise, do make reference to all the websites, and one of the very significant online website or resource was further reading and to understand the work and to keep yourself updated with the notices, circulars, to give a sneak preview into the functioning of United Nations. Do visit www.un.org. Again, United Nations, to conclude, has come a long way, right from taking inspiration from the preceding years, that is ITU in 1865 or UPU in 1874 or International Peace Conference in 1899, or to talk about how there was this Convention for Pacific Settlement of International Disputes in 1902, or to even League of Nations to ILO. United Nations, what we saw in 1945, then it can be aptly concluded, was a supreme example of international cooperation. It was a supreme example of a forum to negotiate and mediate between disputes. Now, the United Nations definitely has done a great job when we try to see it from its predecessor, that is the League of Nations, because League of Nations, as you see that with many countries never joining the organization, League not having its own army, League not able to prevent many crises. In these areas, definitely, when we try to revisit the history, United Nations has made a leap in global aspects. United Nations has proved to be better, definitely, when we try to compare and contrast it with the League of Nations. Limitations may be there, but every organization has its own strengths as well as its own weaknesses. Now, the structure of United Nations is elaborate, very well comprehensive, from General Assembly to Security Council to Economic and Social Council to Trusteeship Council to International Court of Justice to Secretariat. Now, I would advise all the little listeners, do try to make points on the functioning of each and every organ of United Nations. What are the role they are playing? What is their composition? That in itself will be an exercise which will make you have a look at the structure and functions of the United Nations in a holistic way. Now, every organ has its own issues, challenges. Security Council is one of them. For example, reform of Security Council. Dear listeners, do reflect on the fact that does Security Council need reform? Do try to analyze India's case for a permanent membership in the Security Council. All these are again issues of are issues of significance which we all must take into account. So, after having gone through this lecture of United Nations, its structure and its role, it's the role of specialized agencies, funds and programs. I'm sure, dear listeners, you would agree with us that United Nations is a supreme global political organization in order to cater to the issues of the world. Right from its start in 1945 to present 2019, United Nations has indeed come a long way, dealing with the challenges of the world, providing solutions to issues of the world, fostering peace, avoiding war. It has its own drawbacks also, namely unrepresentative nature of the Security Council, namely areas where certain areas where it acted, certain areas where it did not acted, certain issues of legitimacy of sanctions, etc., etc. But nonetheless, to conclude, we can say that United Nations has played a unique role as an international organization in global governance.